So, thank you for joining us today. I am happy to present this morning Andrea Silverstone and Carrie McManus of Sagesse, which is a organization based out of Alberta, here to speak with us today about what is coercive control.
Thanks, Sam. I'm Carrie, and I'm the Director of Innovation and Programs at Sagesse.
And I'm Andrea, and I am the CEO of Sagesse.
And we're super excited to be here today talking with you about coercive control, what we understand about it, and how we understand it across different contexts within the work that we do. So before we get started, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of Sagesse. Who are we? What do we do? And so as an organization, we have been around for almost 40 years. We have a big birthday coming up, I think next year. And we really have been working in that time always from the idea of looking at intervention, prevention, and systems change with a focus directly on domestic abuse. And through that work in domestic abuse, we have come to see intersections with sex workers, with trans LGBTQ individuals, and seeing how coercive control comes up is part of what we'll talk about today, but rooted in our own actual practice experiences as an organization. We operate currently in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, as well as having a national focus in our advocacy work and in our work to create opportunities for coming together like this. So we're so excited to be able to be doing this today to this audience. We really look at how do we work from an opportunity of primary prevention and collective impact. We would like to put ourselves out of work and be able to eradicate the issues that we are looking at and work with all sorts of different populations to be able to do that. So as well as our rooting in our direct client work and our clinical experiences, we're really looking at who intersects and engages and has opportunity to make an impact in domestic abuse and what can that look like. This line is sort of interesting to me because we often don't talk about being experts. We talk about having expertise in things, but we have a lot of expertise in coercive control, both again from our clinical work as well as through the research work that Andrea is doing, and in our advocacy work nationally and internationally around that. And we really believe in innovation across the social service sector. We are an organization that believes that if we're going to actually put ourselves out of work, we need to probably look at doing that differently than we have been doing it for the past 40 years. And really looking at how do we create those opportunities of change so that people are no longer being negatively impacted in the way that they are.
And this is maybe just an opportunity to plug that bottom picture is Carrie and I wrote a book on innovation in the civil society sector that just recently came out. And that's us holding our book at the book launch.
With a super serious look on our faces.
So I want to talk a little bit about the terminology that we're going to be using, our working definition of what coercive control is. I think that one of the things that we are struggling with in Canada right now is that we don't have a universal definition of coercive control, but it is important or interesting to note that recently there is a court case that was around family law that did recently go to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, this definition was the definition that was accepted. It was actually my definition, as well as Carmen Gill, who's a researcher out of New Brunswick. And so coercive control, as we understand it, is an act or a pattern of acts used to regulate and dominate another person's life and remove personal agency. And maybe another way of saying that is it is an act or a pattern of acts that stops someone from being able to act in their own best interests.
So when we're talking about coercive control, I think it's important to be able to sort of frame what is it that we kind of mean around that. I think that there's different places and spaces where this maybe comes up, and so giving some ideas of how do we kind of frame that experience and that sort of language. So when we talk about coercive control, we're talking about different things from charismatic leaders, so those sort of high coercion groups, cults, new religion, state-controlled reform, that following behind of someone. We talk about abusive relationships, which again is where our clinical work has always sort of started and lived within sexual exploitation, intimate partner violence, whatever that sort of relationship of intimacy and trust and the usage of that. And then we're also talking about and framing within a lens of political and social movements. Um, populist, conspiracy, disenfranchised. I think it's also important when we talk about, we've sort of broken this into 3 groups. We also know that coercive control lives across even within these, and that often we see experiences of cults where actually part of the mechanism of coercive control is through an abusive relationship that exists within that cult experience. And so recognizing tools that are helpful to be able to frame, but also not putting sort of parameters around those to say this is one or the other. Part of, I think, what we'll do today when we talk about coercive control is maybe make it feel messier for you before we try to make it feel cleaner. But I think in that complexity, we allow for the true understanding of really what's going on and what we're dealing with and trying to work to address. So I'd say, Jess, when we talk about coercive control, we talk about these 4 sort of components of what we think coercive control it presents as or appears as. So one, coercive control is frequent. When I first started work in this sector, we would talk about the cycle of violence and abuse, the episodic sort of model, and we would talk about these moments of violence, and then everything outside of that was sort of this idea that um, there was nothing bad happening in those sort of moments. And I think that the ability to understand things within a lens of coercive control is to understand that it is frequent, it is ongoing. This is about creating patterns of things, and that frequency and that ongoing tactic is really important. Coercive control is low level. It's hard to get people to understand what coercive control is. It's hard to frame it within a lens of how we understand harm to happen when we think about things that are subtle and low level. And the your key is never in the place where you left it. Doesn't feel like it's abusive. It feels like you're losing your mind, but it doesn't feel like it's abusive. And so that ability to really recognize that low levelness, that sort of keeping at a threshold of those quiet ways that manipulation can take place. Coercive control is cumulative. So again, when we used to talk about the cycle of violence, we would think about things as if sort of violence happened and then there was this sort of clean slate and we started fresh again into a new cycle. But I think with our understanding of coercive control, we look at this from the lens of everything adds up, right? And so that frequency is adds up, and that low levelness adds up. And so what feels like it's low level, that is happening all the time and is cumulative, really starts to build together to be something that is, as Andrea said, taking away that sort of personal agency or that self-determination. We also talk about coercive control being not obvious. And I think in some ways, this is the hardest part of both the lived experience of coercive control as well as the way that we provide intervention, either as an informal supporter or as a service provider, as a friend or family member, is that we don't often see these things. It's not clear from the outside to say that behavior is obviously leading to these to this lived experience. And so all of these things really add to the complexity of how do we define and understand, and how do we identify when coercive control is happening. Something could be happening in your life that is frequent, that is not coercive control. And so how do you take all of these things and add them together? And then for us, when we talk about coercive control, we like to focus on what is the impact and not what is the action. So I've just given you a sort of series of here are some of the actions without naming any particular action, but here are some of how the actions happen. But for us, when talking about coercive control, what's really, really important is this content around what is the impact of those actions. So based off of those actions, someone will feel like they're in an invisible cage. right? They feel like those low level, those cumulative and frequent events make them feel like there's a rule, there's a set of rules, there's bars around them dictating their behavior, their actions, their engagement, but nobody else can see that. And therefore, it's the non-obvious piece. There's no opportunity for engagement or opportunity to move out of that cage. And so the impact is that I feel like I'm isolated. I feel like I'm alone in this space. I feel like I can't make movement outside of that. We also talk about coercive control being like an onion. So people may seem like they are fine on the outside, but this is about peeling back into those sort of deeper issues and deeper levels. Again, what is the part that we don't see? And what is the part, not from an action perspective that we don't see, but what is the impact that is not obvious from the outside? When we have talked previously about experiences of domestic abuse specifically, we've always talked about what can you see, what makes sense, right? And you could see that an onion is rotten on the outside. You could see that somebody has a broken arm or a black eye, but if we actually understand that what we're talking about is the impact, something can look fine from the outside, but it might be that the inner layers are being negatively impacted, and that's where we need to provide support. We also talk about this idea of coercive control being like a Jenga tower, and what does it mean and sort of look like to feel like your life is this Jenga tower where at any point in time a block could be removed or a block could be added that will create this level of destabilization. And I think often, there's probably lots of people in the world who live, unfortunately, from this sort of perspective of destabilization or this sort of unknowing place. And part of what we understand within coercive control is that the people who are creating that destabilization are named actors. It goes back to the slide when we talked about sort of the framing of coercive control behind a charismatic leader or an abusive partner. And so that impact of feeling like you can't make choices or create stability for yourself is part of what we identify when we're looking at and thinking about coercive control within the frame of the Jenga tower.
So one of the things that we've noticed in our research is that there's a real siloing of responses when it comes to coercive control. Many of the responses are focused on episodic and narrow interventions and are often intimate partner violence focused. They're shelter stay, or they're helping someone to exit perhaps a coercively controlling situation without understanding that there are these long-term impacts. Or like Carrie had talked about, they're very focused on the physical impacts of coercive control. One of the things that Carrie and I wrote an article a few years ago about the social service sector or the nonprofit sector being its own industrial complex. Because one of the things that we've noticed is that the way that we've organized ourselves is not based on the impacts and the experiences of those who have experienced coercive control, but based on how funding is given out. And also on Elizabethan poor laws that are about the model of charities that was about enforcing morality. So we don't see that organizations say, if you are experiencing these impacts, please come to our organization and we'll support you and we'll understand that you're a full human being that might actually be experiencing this in lots of different areas of your life, whether it's in a cultic situation or an intimate partner violence situation or in a organized crime or a gang. We say to somebody, you need to go based on who did what to you. So if someone perpetrated domestic violence against you, go to domestic violence agency. If someone perpetrated sexual exploitation, go to a trafficking agency. If someone perpetrated some sort of high coercion cultic experience, go to a cultic agency. And so what we're doing is we're making people organize themselves based on who the perpetrator is, not their experience as the victim. And what we've learned through that is that we've started talking about it not in terms of who the perpetrator was and what the perpetrator did, but in terms of the impacts And what we've heard from those who we work with is that they really resonate with the definitions and the understanding of coercive control and are very frustrated with the siloing of it. And so one of the things that we think we really need to do in our sector is start to break down that siloing of responses.
I often think about conversations that I've had with service providers before in the domestic abuse field about supporting those who are impacted by sexual exploitation. And they have said to me, like, we can't take on those extra clients. We don't have the bandwidth. And I have said to them, you already are taking on those clients. They're just not telling you. And so what does it mean for us as service providers to actually recognize that we are creating barriers to people getting the things that they need because we are actually creating those requirements of siloing or of coming up and saying only the thing that is applicable here. I'm here at a domestic abuse organization. I'm going to talk about this here, then I'm going to go somewhere else and I'm going to talk about this other experience that I have, because we're not creating the opportunity for that to live integrated.
So I am actually currently in the midst of doing my PhD in applied psychology with a focus on coercive control. And one of the things that I've been trying to do through the research, both through interviews with service providers as well as those with lived experience, is to understand what are all the contexts, and as well as an extensive literature review, what are all the contexts that coercive control exists in. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is the list of the context of coercive control that have emerged so far from the research, as well as emerged from our lived experience as an organization of people who have walked through our doors. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I mean when we say each of these contexts. So one of the contexts that we know is very prevalently understood as having coercive control is domestic abuse and dating violence. And I don't think I have to talk too much about this because this is actually the area that is most explored, most talked about, and most understood. We also know that coercive control exists in sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, and sexual abuse, that there's a pattern of behavior that happens that takes away an individual's sense of personal agency. And actually, Carrie and I and one of my professors wrote a paper not so long ago for the Federal Ombudsman of Victims of Crime about the intersection of sexual exploitation and coercive control, and how Canadian legislation actually needs to be looking at that when they're looking at coercive control, the criminalization of coercive control. We also know that coercive control pops up a lot in gangs and organized crime, and it pops up a lot both for victims of coercive control who by a gang might be forced into criminal activities such as trafficking of drugs or weapons, or they might be forced into sexual exploitation, or they might be trafficked. We also know that so I'm talking about sort of the victims of organized crime and gangs, but we also know that people who are in gangs themselves, gang members, are often victims of coercive control. And so I think it's really important to understand it from that perspective, because I think that so often we just like look at, gangs and organized crime as something totally separate and don't even think about the coercive control nature of what's going on. We of course know that coercive control exists in cults and high coercion groups. That's probably part of what has been most extensively written about in the research. People like Lifton and Singer and Hassan have all written about cults and high coercion groups. And of course, my PhD supervisors, Rod and Linda Deborah Marshall. There's religious and spiritual context that we see coercive control happening. And we've actually seen that hit the news quite a bit, especially in terms of some of the childhood sexual assault that we see, as well as from some of the more fundamental spiritual contexts or religious contexts. We see it in child abuse, large systems. One of the bits of research that we've also done is around how large systems are used to perpetrate coercive control. And so by large systems, we mean the justice system, we mean the child abuse or the child welfare system. Those large systems can often be used to perpetrate coercive control against the people who are necessitate the use of those systems. I'm also just going to add another area in here that I haven't put in here, but has been emerging from the research, is high performance athletes. We know that we've been seeing high coercive control amongst high performance athletes. And we've actually been seeing it for a very long time, but it hasn't been talked about in terms of coercive control. We saw the Larry Nassar case in Canada. Sheldon Kennedy is very famous for talking about his experiences of abuse and coercive control, although he doesn't call it coercive control, he calls it abuse. We see it in workplaces. One of the people who is someone who's one of the leading thinkers in North America around coercive control, her name is Lisa Aronson Fontes, who's written extensively about coercive control, and IPV has now started writing about workplace coercive control. And of course, we see it in cultural contexts as well.
It's interesting, the high performance athlete thing sort of makes me think about the places where we have tolerance for coercive control because we think that it adds a social good or a social benefit versus the places where it does not. I mean, you could also talk about religious and spiritual context within that lens. Sorry, just a thought I had.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that's sort of the point of this whole area of coercive control is it's very under-researched and it's just emerging. And so I think that we probably don't even recognize all the places that it exists, and those that are impacted probably don't recognize it and aren't able to name it because it's so under-researched. So I think that what's really important to note is that the context of coercive control can be co-occurring or intersecting, and we see that a lot. At Sagesse, we see that a lot in the clients that walk through our door, and in my research, I'm seeing it a lot in terms of the expression of both those with lived experience as well as those who helped those who have lived experience. So some of the things that we often see is domestic abuse and sexual exploitation. We talk about this a lot in terms of often the pimp is often the person who also they might have a child with, so they're the baby daddy. Often a pimp relationship actually starts as an intimate partner relationship. We also see it in terms of someone both either being sexually exploited by their partner, but we've also seen it that someone's being sexually exploited by their family, for example. We also see it in terms of sexual exploitation in high coercion groups or cults and gangs. We know that there are cults that definitely sexually exploit their members. We actually know of one that just hit the news in Canada, which was NXIVM, which was very prominent, that had a whole sex trafficking component to it. And of course, we know that gangs are often involved in sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, prostitution. We see it in workplace and religious spiritual context. Some of the things that we've seen both through our clients as well as through my research is that someone might have not a lot of education because they grew up in, let's say, a cultic environment, or their education is limited. And so then therefore where they end up working is somewhere that the cultic environment has supported them to find. And maybe in that religious or spiritual context, they're being abused in their workplace, but they're unable to separate those things out. We see it in terms of large systems in domestic abuse. That's in terms of the child welfare system and the court system. And we often also see cultural contexts in domestic abuse, where someone has a sense that should they leave their cultural, that the domestic abuse is so bad that they leave their cultural context, there's going to be a lot of negative trade-offs, or their cultural contexts are allowing them to believe that the domestic abuse is okay. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just some examples. One of the participants who I interviewed for my research said this quote, which I just love, around the co-occurrences and similarities, is they said, okay, the parallels of all of this is that once you know one, if I may say Martian, you know the group. So this was an individual who worked with, who's a therapist who works with people in lots of different contexts, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, cults, gangs, and essentially they're like, once you know one Martian, you know them all, that it's very, very similar across all contexts. So I want to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of coercive control. So there are some historical as well as modern thinkers who have talked about what are the mechanisms of coercive control. And Bitterman is someone who researched, and Lifton, who reached this in the 50s and 60s, who talked about it in a state-sponsored environment. Singer talked about it in a cultic environment. Hassan talks about it in a cultic environment and in a domestic violence environment, as well as in a populist environment. He recently wrote a book called The Cult of Trump. Stark talks about it a lot in a domestic violence environment. Dubra Marshall and Dubra Marshall think about it in terms of the cross-contextual environments. And so sort of trying to meld all of the ways that all of these thinkers talk about the mechanisms of coercive control. I wanted to share these with you because I think that these are the mechanisms that exist regardless or of the context, that every single context that I just talked about, we see these mechanisms of coercive control. So of course we see mechanisms of isolation from friends and family, isolation from information, isolation from supports. We often see the monopolization of perception, and deception. So there's a real suppression of critical thinking. And so whether that's happening in a state-sponsored way where you have groupthink, or in a cultic way where you're not allowed to critically think and you have to buy into one way of thinking, or in a cult of one, as Hassan calls it, or a domestic violence situation where there's a suppression of critical thinking, that you have to think the way that your abusive partner does about your relationship, about the context of your relationship, and about people outside of the relationship. The other thing that we've seen across all contexts is induced debility or exhaustion. And so essentially this is referred to as Lenora Walker's learned helplessness in the context of domestic violence. And so sometimes this is about actually keeping someone up so that they don't have capacity to think because their brain is just starved for sleep and refreshment. Sometimes this is about, in a domestic violence situation, couples that fight all night and then go to work all day and then fight some more. And so they are not able to ever get perspective or to step back, or someone who keeps someone else up. Of course, there's the threats. If you don't comply with what I need you to comply with, then I'm going to harm you, harm your friends or family, or do something that's going to be very terrible. We work a lot with the 2S LGBTQ community. Some of those threats involve threats of outing. I think that this is a really interesting one, which is the occasional indulgences. And we know that this is sort of what keeps people often in coercively controlling situations, that because they're given an occasional indulgence, they let their guard down, and they're also able to experience a sense of maybe it's not as bad as I think it is, or maybe this person isn't as bad, or maybe I've misperceived what's going on because look at this very good thing that's happening right now. Often the perpetrator or perpetrators of coercive control have demonstrations of omnipotence or omniscience. It's that I know everything. I can see you even when you're not with me. I can control your life even when you're not with me. One of the most poignant people that I spoke to in my research around a demonstration of omnipotence is that she was told that her cult leader had astral projection, which meant that no matter where she was and no matter what she did, that her cult leader could see her and know what she was thinking. And even as an adult, when she had already left the cult and was in therapy, she was still unable to express what was going on because she was pretty sure the cult leader was in the room with her. Now, in terms of domestic abuse or sexual exploitation, often those have to do with actual, tracking systems, using technology to track somebody. We have a case that in our agency that we dealt with where the perpetrator bought an apartment above and to the corner of our client so that they were able to continuously monitor and look in the windows of our client. Or it's also using third parties, right? Friends and family to try and track and watch. Degradations, I don't think I have to explain this, the enforcing of trivial demands. This is a little bit about that Jenga piece that Carrie was talking about. It's also often referred to as crazy making. Just the inspiring of fear and panic. The other thing is a desensitization, right? And so what happens is that the individual, we sometimes talk about it in terms of a frog in boiling water. Someone doesn't start day one, whether that's a cult or sexual exploitation, being abused and being controlled. It is a small process, a slow process that's gradual and then sudden. And so what often happens in that process is a desensitization. And so you don't even realize what's going on. And of course, that control of information. So there are measures of coercive control that are available, but they're very limited, and they're also mostly all intimate partner violence focused. And so those measures of coercive control often measure the list of behaviors and the mechanisms. So they measure things like, is the person able to make decisions or to make decisions in their own best interest? Is there faith-based control? Is there threats or harassment or stalking or disempowerment or isolation? But it's usually all in the context of of domestic violence and a one-on-one relationship. And so some of the measurement tools that are out there, and all of them are measurement tools that are domestic violence focused, with the exception of the CCSI coercive control something scale 12, because there's 12 questions. But everything else is very, very, very IPV focused. And for the most part, these measurement tools, with the exception of a few of them, they don't necessarily measure the impacts, they measure the actions. And so we know that there's a limitation when you're measuring the actions, because we often talk about how coercive control is in the eye of the beholder. So one of the examples we often give is that my partner could show up every day at lunch and bring me flowers and a snack, and I could feel like that is the biggest expression of love, and appreciate it. But my partner, who's trying to control me, could also be showing up every day with flowers and a snack to know if I'm at work, who I'm talking to, and what I'm doing. And now that's coercive control. And so when you measure actions, you're actually not measuring coercive control. You're just measuring what someone is doing. When you say, are you afraid, or do you feel that you can't make a decision in your own best interest, that's when you begin to measure coercive control. So those are the limitations, as I talked about, of the measures of coercive control. And I think that what's really interesting is that when you ask service providers who are experienced in working in the area of coercive control, regardless of what the area is, whether it's domestic violence, cultic experiences, they'll often talk about how for them, it's a somatic experience, right? I think that there's a famous quote, what was his name? Larry Flynn, the guy who, I think he fought the US government in a Supreme Court case around pornography, because there was no definitions of pornography. And he said, his lawyer said to the judge, like, how do you define pornography? And the judge was like, I'll know it when I see it. Right. And I think often about that in terms of coercive control, that many service providers say, I know it when I see it. I feel it in my body. I just know when someone's telling me the story of their experiences, that this is an experience of coercive control, but it's not measurable. For most service providers, it's just a knowing that they have, which is great because it helps them with their clients, but it's not good, because if we want to criminalize coercive control, you can't criminalize something that's a feeling. We have to be able to measure it and talk about the measurements of it. Some of also the limitations that are on the current tools, aside from the fact that they measure patterns of behavior, they don't measure patterns of behavior, they measure patterns of actions that the perpetrator did, is that they don't measure cumulative harm. And they also sometimes are missing gender sensitivities. And so I think for all of those reasons, we need better measures of coercive control. But I think that the place that we need to start is unearthing how this somatic experience of understanding works for service providers, because they're obviously tapping into something that they're just not able yet to articulate.
It's also very interesting because it really shows the limitations of service providers, of service provision, if you're not somebody who is steeped in coercive control research, understanding, or has enough clinical experience and background to be able to have that somatic experience, right? And so we actually are creating barriers to people accessing effective coercive control support by saying, people will just know it when they see it. But what if, as a service provider, I don't? Because I can think about clients that I saw in my very early days that I look back now and go, oh my God, that was absolutely coercive control, but I didn't have a lens for it at the time. And so my lack of education or ability to tap into that somatic experience led to that client not getting necessarily as nuanced or effective a response from me as a service provider.
I also think that if we don't have measures and we don't have ways to talk about it, we're also going to limit who help seeks for it. So one of the things that we know is that when so the United Kingdom has criminalization of coercive control. They implemented it in 2016. They passed in 2015 and implemented in 2016. But in 2011, the Home Office and the police started talking about the passing of a legislation to criminalize coercive control. And between 2011 and 2015, calls to the police asking for support went up 31% because people then started to see themselves in the definition of coercive control and then started help seeking. Well, you know, Carrie, talking about our early careers, I think about so much at the beginning of, I've been working forever together, but at the very beginning of our work, so often people would call our agency and say, I think I'm in a bad situation. I think I'm being abused. I'm not really sure. And they were also so worried about taking away resources from someone who they thought actually deserved it because they were being physically or sexually abused. And so, we used to call them people in the pre-contemplative stage using Prochaska and De Clemente's models, but actually what they were people who were experiencing coercive control, and we didn't have language to say it to them, and they didn't have language for it themselves. And how many people who were like, I'm not sure, I don't know, didn't even bother making the call because they weren't sure and didn't know. And so
And how much, well, I was going to say, how much is the lived experience of people who call us? Because I'm sure people still call us and say the same thing, but how much has their lived experience changed? Because now we can say to them, absolutely, this is what's going on. Let's talk about it. And we ourselves can provide a better, more effective response.
Yeah. And I also think what's really interesting about that process that we go through with people is that, Carrie started this by saying that some of the agencies we work with are like, no, we can't do that work because we're going to be overwhelmed with clients. And we're like, no, you're already seeing those clients. And so one of the things that's really interesting is once we started talking about coercive control with our clients, all of a sudden we started getting disclosures of all of the ways in their life that coercive control exists. So they would start talking about coercive control in high coercion groups. So whether it was a cult or a gang or an experience like that, or they would start to talk about it in terms of their religious or spiritual experiences, or talk about it in terms of sexual exploitation or workplace coercive control. And so once we started talking about it, then all of a sudden they had language to identify the ways that it was happening in other parts of their life, which was also really interesting because I think that we were seeing less recidivism amongst those clients because they got what they needed the first time around. It wasn't like, okay, I dealt with the intimate partner violence now, but I'm still not better and I don't know why I'm still not better. Maybe I should go back and take a group again, or maybe I should go back and see a therapist again. When actually what it was is that we weren't addressing the fullness of an individual's needs. And so I think in many ways, to be able to measure coercive control and not measure it in a specific context, but measure it for the individual's experience, we're actually going to allow them to tell us their experience of coercive control, not us telling them, oh, you're a victim of a cult or you're a victim of domestic violence.
Which I think is so important and impactful in terms of what that healing journey and experience looks like, right? It's not for me to say, this is what that you're a victim of this particular thing, but for people to say, I actually feel like this part of this experience was led to this outcome or this impact, and this part of this experience led to this. It's something that I could think, oh my God, that would impact me in this way that would remove my personal agency or create fear, could not have the same impact for somebody else. And so how do we remove ourselves and our own sort of social judgment about actions and behaviors and impacts, and really center clients within that?
So another piece that I'm just reflecting on as we're talking around the identifying of coercive control. So we use something called the feedback informed treatment model, which was founded by Scott Miller. And essentially it measures a person's overall well-being, but it's a narrative tool. So it really allows people to tell you their experiences, not you telling them what you think their experiences should be. And years ago, like almost 20 years ago, I took a training with Scott Miller, which is what made our organization shift into feedback informed treatment. And in the training, Scott Miller played a series of sessions that he and a colleague did with a client, that the client was very stuck and the client was unable to make movement and the client wasn't getting any better and they couldn't figure out why. And when they shifted to a feedback informed treatment model, it finally loosened things up and allowed for the client to be able to talk about their experiences. But it was really interesting because the first sessions that he shared with us that we watched, The client had an addiction issue, and the client talked a lot about their addictions. And the client talked about the limiting factors of their addiction and how the addiction manifested in their life, but they were having a really, really hard time getting to the underlying components of the addiction because they just kept focusing on, he's an addict and we need to deal with the fact that he's an addict. So at one point they decide to shift and they decide to take a feedback informed treatment model, which essentially says, like, what are your presenting issues, right? Looking back over the past week, how are you doing in these areas of your life? And once they sort of allowed the person to identify, the person started talking about religious coercion that they were experiencing, and religious coercion that actually had also included sexual assault as a child that was never really dealt with. And the addictions were a coping mechanism for all of that. But because they just kept asking the individual about their addictions, that's the only answers that they were getting. But once they opened it up for a conversation of, tell me your journey, tell me your experience, all of a sudden the bubbling up of the coercive control emerged, and then those themes of coercive control emerged in many parts of that individual's life. And just going back to that monopolization of perception and the sense of omniscience, the person felt almost unable to talk about their history of childhood sexual abuse within their high coercion religious environment, because there was this sense that there was an omniscience on behalf of the individuals that had perpetrated it when they were a child. But they would have gotten to none of that would they not have engaged in a feedback informed treatment model that allowed the person to identify for themselves what was going on, not the practitioner defining for the person. So
Which
these
is,
are, sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
no, I was just going to say, which is why to me it's so interesting to have a slide like this, because I think that what people want and really what we're sort of craving as practitioners is like, what are the impacts? What are we going to see? How are we going to know? And so part of what I will say before Andrea walks through this slide is that it's important to have this, and it is more important to do that work individually to connect in and to utilize the information that's coming directly from someone, rather than us say, oh, I see what you're seeing. I hear what you're saying. And therefore, what's happening is that you're having this cognitive and executive functioning issue, and that's based on coercive control. So just a caution before we give you a bunch of information.
This is not in any way, shape, or form a checklist, even a little bit. What this is a manifestation of the impacts of coercive control. And so some of the manifestations of coercive control that we see is of, PTSD, depression, disassociation, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. We see this very, very commonly. I feel like this is probably one of the most common impacts that we see of coercive control. When something is cumulative and something is low level and something goes on for a very long time, those are all of the exact, kind of the groundwork that is laid in order for someone to develop PTSD and depression. And of course, anxiety. The other thing that we see a lot of is cognitive and executive functioning. And this is actually really important to note, because once someone's cognitive and executive functioning is impacted, it makes it very, very hard for them, and I'll talk a little bit about this, to have any self-efficacy or to engage in any help seeking. We know and we see the impact of toxic stress on the brain, and we also see the impact of that on the developing brain. And so I think it's really important to note that, executive functioning allows you to be able to prioritize and make decisions. And if that's impacted, it's really, really hard to make decisions in your own best interest. We, of course, see a lot of self-esteem and shame, and we see self-esteem and shame both in terms of a person betraying their own sense of self, the acts that they engage in, and in cases of high coercion groups or cults or sometimes sexual exploitation, they will find themselves possibly perpetrating coercive control on someone else because they're being coercively controlled. And that also leads to a lot of self-esteem and shame. We see impacts in their ability to have self-efficacy and help seek. We see a lot of existential and spiritual trauma, and that goes to someone's core identity. And there's a lot of attachment issues that we see, as well as risk and protective factors. One of the things that I very deeply believe is that foundational to everything is attachment, and that either someone has some sort of disorganized attachment, whether it's anxious or avoidant or disorganized, that can possibly be a risk factor. But the other thing is that part of what coercive control does is often try and take someone that might have secure attachment and create disorganized attachment for them, or take someone who has already insecure attachments and make it even worse. So some of the risk factors that we see for coercive control are age, gender, a history of trauma, some unstable mental health, tenuous relational arena, and then the intersection of risk factors, economic and societal challenges, naivety of the individual, and socioecological arenas also can be an impact. Those are the push and pull factors. And the biggest protective factors are the socioecological arenas, and if they're the first generation of a cult versus being a second generation cult, that a protective factor is that they just joined the cult, not that they were born into the cult. Although it still makes them at risk, it acts as a protective factor, and of course, secure attachment. And then another thing that we see is an exacerbation of pre-existing mental health conditions. We're almost done, and then we'll open it up for questions. These are some of the commonly noted interventions that exist for coercive control. We do a lot of, specifically in our work, psychoeducational and peer-based interventions, as well as, doing safety as well. But one of the things that I appreciate is that there's not one type of intervention, that the intervention is very tailored for the individual's experience, and not every individual is going to benefit from every type of intervention. I think that what's really interesting is that some of the practitioners who work in this area use what are called etiological interventions, which are interventions that get to that existential and spiritual trauma, which I think is really important, because I think often in a therapeutic environment, we don't get into etiological interventions because, yeah, I don't know about other people, but for sure as a social worker and as a therapist, I'm trained not to I'm not trained not to wander into the spiritual or religious realms. But when someone has religious and spiritual trauma, it's really important that we do wander into those realms, because that's the meaning-making framework that they're using on their life. And then there are justice system interventions. In Canada, our civil law, which is our family law, does, as well as torts. Our civil law currently does have a provision for coercive control in deciding the best interests of the child. There's also some tort law that does sort of get to the issues of coercive control through stalking, harassment, and domestic abuse. And there was recently a case in front of the Supreme Court to try and make a new tort of domestic abuse. That's still waiting to be seen. And in terms of our criminal code, we do not have coercive control legislation, but that's something that our agency is working on, and we're happy to talk more about.
So what are some of the sort of conclusions and recommendations that we would have around coercive control, and how we should be engaging in those conversations across Canada? So really, I think understanding and acknowledging the co-occurrence of coercive control in different contexts for individuals, breaking down those silos, creating opportunities for common measures, both formal and informal measures, and developing those sort of commonalities in our interventions. So really recognizing the restrictions that happen for the individuals based off of what we as service providers are putting onto them in terms of access to information, service, support, etc. And then again, further research into the experiences of those co-occurrences, and really working to understand what does that how deep does that sort of look and live for people, and then what is the impact for people who are able to engage in support and healing from an understanding of the complexity of multiple experiences of coercive control in different arenas, versus looking at those sort of individualized siloed responses. What's the difference or the impact that can be made for individuals?